Sergeant Caleb Morgan had already faced hell 3 times, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in the eyes of a colleague who, during training, tried to strangle him while shouting that the trees were full of eyes. But nothing, not even real crossfire, could prepare him for the 72 hours in which his men would become shadows of themselves, seized by a silent outbreak that no one would dare officially record. What had been injected into their veins had a hidden purpose, and when it was all over, the silence was more deafening than the gunshots. The warning arrived in a black envelope, sealed with the Special Operations Command crest. Caleb Morgan, a respected and disciplined veteran, received the summons with the coldness of someone who has seen too much. It was just another exercise, the paper said. 3 uninterrupted days in the field, simulating combat in an isolated area. Nothing out of the ordinary. But something about the laconic tone, the lack of a detailed briefing, and the rush to assemble the platoon made his instincts light up like matches. On the morning of departure, an unknown officer showed up at the base with a metal briefcase. He had the posture of someone who didn't answer to anyone there. He ordered all 12 soldiers assigned to Exercise Bravo to undergo a routine medical assessment. Caleb was surprised. They had never had such thorough examinations before a drill, let alone intravenous applications. But there, in that world, orders weren't debated. They were carried out. Everyone received a dose. No explanations, no records. The men were boarded before the sun had even risen. In the helicopter, Caleb watched the faces around him. Some were laughing, excited about the mission. Others, more experienced like him, kept their gazes fixed and their mouths clenched. There was a tense silence between them. Something invisible but palpable weighed in the air, and it was only the beginning. Arriving at the insertion zone, Caleb noticed that none of the soldiers were new. They were tough men, many of whom had already served with him in extreme situations. They were the tested ones, as they informally called them on base, people who had seen the worst and were still standing. The choice, he thought, was no coincidence. This was no ordinary exercise. This was an experiment with very well-selected parts. The sergeant reconnoitered the terrain with Lieutenant Avery, his right-hand man. The radio only worked on one frequency, direct communication with the command center, and nothing else. There was no physical map, just digital coordinates relayed by an encrypted tablet. The mission seemed clear. Survive 72 hours in constant motion, dealing with simulated targets, unstable weather, and complete deprivation of resources. But everything was mysteriously too precise. It was as if someone knew exactly where they were going to step before they even stepped foot. As they set up their first camp, Caleb gathered the group for a quick meeting. He noticed a strange restlessness among the soldiers. It wasn't fear. It was agitation, dilated eyes, hands restless, accelerated pulse. These were clear signs of neurochemical excitement, but no one had eaten or drunk anything out of the ordinary, except for the routine injection. The sergeant began to mentally record every detail. He knew something had changed inside those men. On the second night, Caleb realized that no one had slept. Literally none of the soldiers even lay down for more than 5 minutes. Some just walked around in circles. Others did push-ups compulsively, as if their bodies wouldn't let them stop. Private Tyler, the youngest of the group, commented with a shaky smile that he felt electric. "It's like there's caffeine in your bones, Sergeant," he said. But Caleb didn't laugh. Lieutenant Avery, always calm, confessed to the commander that he had felt a metallic taste in his mouth immediately after the IV. He hadn't said anything at the time, but now he thought it was relevant. They began to connect the dots. No medical protocol had been followed, no one had signed a consent form, and the doctor in charge hadn't even formally introduced himself. One of them, Jones, tried to find records of the drug on the military tablet system. The answer? Access denied. On the third day, the unease gave way to something more worrying. Tyler had an outburst. He started digging desperately in the ground, saying that there was a buried mechanism that he needed to remove. When the others tried to restrain him, he reacted with disproportionate force, shouting that his bones were being replaced by metal. Caleb intervened firmly, but he felt the first shiver run down his spine. It wasn't just a hallucination. It was the collapse of a mind that was being manipulated by something they didn't understand. The tablet's timer went off. It was time to leave. The group had to cross a dense forest, with tactical obstacles and simulated threats. But the forest seemed alive, not because of the environment, but because of the eyes of the soldiers walking through it. Every hour, a new, strange behavior emerged. One started laughing for no reason. Another muttered words in Latin, even though he had no religious background. Their physical endurance, however, was impressive. They climbed hills as if the weight of their equipment didn't exist. They ran for kilometers without a break. Private Reeves even broke his little finger in a fall, but showed no pain. He continued marching with the bone exposed, as if nothing had happened. Caleb went on high alert. That wasn't just adrenaline. It was as if the brakes had been taken off his body and his soul. At the end of the first night, Caleb tried to organize a break. He proposed that they rest, taking turns waking up. But no one wanted to sleep. They said it was dangerous, that the enemy was nearby. When he asked who the enemy was, he received only blank stares. One of them, his eyes glazed over, replied, "They know what we've done. They're inside the earth." Caleb didn't sleep that night. At the start of the second morning, the feeling was pure euphoria. The soldiers seemed invincible. They had crossed a dangerous ravine without using ropes. They hunted and ate a snake without hesitation. They were in a state of supervigilance, perceiving sounds from miles away, reacting with superhuman reflexes. Caleb wondered how that performance was possible, but at the same time, he feared what would come next. Private Briggs, a usually quiet man, began to sing old war songs. He wouldn't stop. He marched and sang, his eyes watering and his voice breaking. When asked, he simply said, "I've been hearing these songs in my head since yesterday. They don't stop." Caleb watched him intently. The sweat, the trembling hands, the lack of focus, everything indicated a neurological overload. But the physical performance was like that of an Olympic athlete at his peak. Lieutenant Avery tried to contact command, but the radio now only emitted static. There were no answers, no updated coordinates. They were alone, lost in what was supposed to be an exercise. But Caleb's greatest fear wasn't geographical. It was the growing certainty that they were being used as guinea pigs, and that, at any moment, one of them could break. At the turn of 24 hours, something changed dramatically. The look on the soldiers' faces was no longer the same. There was no tiredness, no hunger, but there was no humanity either. Their eyes seemed stuck on something that wasn't there, as if they were seeing another reality behind the forest. Caleb noticed this first in Reeves, who was walking with his head slightly tilted, muttering, "They're on the right. They're waiting for someone to fall." The sergeant tried to gather the group together for a quick assessment. He wanted to talk, to look everyone in the eye, but hardly anyone could sustain a coherent dialogue. Perkins, always rational, spoke in non-existent codes, as if he were deciphering radio transmissions in his mind. Private Harker began to draw shapes on the ground with charcoal, concentric circles, and incomprehensible symbols. "They're portals," he said. "They put us here to open portals." Avery, although still lucid, began to feel the same effects. He told Caleb that he was having time lapses. I blinked, and everyone was 10 meters away, as if time had cut out. Caleb then realized that they weren't just experiencing a side effect. They were in the throes of a collective, induced mental breakdown. The substance applied wasn't a simple stimulant. It was something that messed with the foundations of consciousness. Caleb was a man trained in discipline, but he knew when it was a trap. He started keeping a notebook with detailed notes, schedules, behaviors, phrases spoken. He was determined to record everything, even if no one else remembered. And deep down, he no longer trusted that they would. Time seemed to flow in a distorted way, as if the days were compressed into hours. It was that night that he began to take samples. He scraped some of Reeves's sweat onto a cloth, collected sheets that the soldiers said vibrated to the touch, and hid the notebook inside his tactical vest. His plan was simple: survive and tell what he saw. But to do so, he would have to remain lucid, and that was becoming scarcer by the hour. During a night patrol, Caleb heard footsteps behind him, fast, rhythmic, like someone running barefoot through the woods. When he turned around, there was no one there, but one of the soldiers, who had stayed behind, appeared a few minutes later with a bloody nose and said, "I heard it too, and they whispered that the time is wrong." Caleb marked the time in his notebook, shivering. They were falling, one by one, In the 36 hours, none of the soldiers had shown any biological need. It was as if the body had disconnected from its most basic needs. That in itself was terrifying. But the worst thing was the absence of fear. Soldiers who knew the terror of real combat crossed dangerous zones with smiles on their faces. One of them, Kendrick, advanced alone against a bear crossing his path and shouted, "Let's see if he's been programmed too." The situation became uncontrollable. Caleb tried to impose direct commands, order, discipline, but the soldiers looked at him as if he were an unnecessary intermediary. They were operating by another kind of logic. It was as if a higher part of their minds had been activated or replaced. They reacted like machines, but felt like prophets. They spoke of messages received, of invisible lines in the sky, of missions that only they could fulfill. No sleep, no hunger, no fear. Caleb understood. It wasn't a flaw. It was the goal. The compound, whatever it was, turned soldiers into purely functional weapons, without humanity. And now, the only unpredictable variable was mental collapse. What would come first, death or madness? It was Reeves who broke down first, trying to wake him from a trance in which he kept repeating the phrase, "They're all in." The soldier attacked Caleb with a combat knife. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. His eyes were black, empty, without any sign of recognition. It took 3 soldiers to restrain him, and even then, 2 were injured. The attack shattered the tenuous illusion of control. Caleb realized that from then on, anyone could attack, not out of anger, but out of some internal trigger that even they didn't understand. Reeves was tied up with parachute ropes and isolated in a safe zone. Still, he laughed alone, looking up at the sky. He muttered, "The clock is broken, but they still count the time." After the attack, the soldiers began to avoid eye contact. They seemed to recognize that something had contaminated them. But instead of fear, what they felt was acceptance, as if they had understood something that Caleb had not, as if they knew that their destiny was not to return, only to fulfill a cycle. Caleb, however, would not give up. He would do his best to get at least one of them out alive. From the 48th hour onwards, the voices began. They weren't ordinary whispers. They were complete dialogues. Caleb heard names, orders, even words from his childhood being spoken in the dark of the forest. At first he thought it was a hallucination, until Avery approached with wide eyes and said, "They know my daughter's name. I just heard it." The voices weren't coming from a specific direction. They seemed to be inside everyone's head, but with variations. Each soldier heard something different. Harker was laughing and talking to the sergeant who died in Fallujah. Kendrick swore he was talking to his mother, who had been dead for years. Tyler was shouting at his own reflection in a puddle of water. And the worst, they all believed they were lucid. Caleb tried to keep everyone together, but the group began to disperse of its own accord. "They want us to find our origins," said Briggs. "If we follow the sound, we'll understand." Avery begged Caleb to trust. "I saw something there. Something real. They're preparing us." At that point, the sergeant realized that it was no longer just a question of survival. It was a war against the loss of reality itself. In the early hours of the 49th hour, Caleb found Perkins naked, kneeling in the middle of the trail, his eyes fixed on an invisible point ahead. He was muttering a fragmented prayer, mixing words in English, Russian, and a language no one recognized. His lips were trembling, but his body remained as still as stone. When Caleb approached, Perkins only whispered, "They're already inside me. There's no turning back." Avery examined the soldier and confirmed what everyone feared. His body temperature was dangerously high, his heartbeat irregular, and his pupils dilated as if he were overdosing. Perkins began to bleed from his nose, then from his ears. Caleb ordered immediate evacuation. There was still a protocol for serious emergencies. They tried radioing for help, but again, only static. When they turned their eyes to Perkins, he was unconscious, his body stiffening in silent convulsions. The group carried him, improvising a stretcher with branches and tarpaulins. Along the way, Perkins woke up. He looked at Caleb and, with a thread in his voice, said, "They've shown me the end. You can't stop it." He died seconds later. The first body, the first of those who wouldn't be coming home. But Caleb felt it wouldn't be the last. After Perkins's death, the others began to decline rapidly. Conversations were interrupted by incoherent words. The soldiers no longer recognized time. Some thought they were still on the first day. Others asked for Perkins, as if he were standing right next to them. And then came the episodes of group aggression, not directed at anyone in particular. It was a rage against everything, against heaven itself. Kendrick destroyed the navigation tablet, shouting that the eyes were watching over there. Briggs tore off part of his uniform, saying it was making noise. Harker began to mark the trees with his own blood, creating symbols that resembled the drawings made days before. Caleb could no longer distinguish lucidity from delirium in his men. The only certainty was that they were all collapsing. It was Avery who begged them to back off. "We need to leave. We need to leave now. This isn't a test. It's an induced massacre." For the first time, the lieutenant was shaking. And then, in a moment of apparent clarity, he said something Caleb would never forget. "They're measuring us. Every second. Every response." The sergeant decided they would try to escape, with or without authorization. Caleb finally managed to find a high ground where the radio seemed to emit a cleaner signal. He used a maximum-level emergency protocol, something he had never had to do before. After 7 minutes of static, a voice answered. It was female, robotic, with a neutral accent. It simply said, "Your request has been received. Continue with the exercise. Monitoring level, active." And she hung up. It was confirmation. Command knew, and it was monitoring everything. There was no rescue. There was no concern. There was just observation. Caleb slammed the radio against the trunk of a tree. He felt betrayed, used, not by any external enemy, but by his own superiors. Those men, his brothers in uniform, were being deliberately sacrificed in the name of a project that no one would admit existed. He gathered the remaining group. There were only 7 of them. He told them that they could no longer trust any command. The new mission was to survive and get out of the forest. Avery, although exhausted, was supportive, but Kendrick refused. "They won't let us," he said, pointing to the sky. "They're still watching." Then, without warning, he ran into the woods and disappeared. He never came back. Caleb knew. He had chosen the side of delirium. At the end of the 72 hours, there were 5 of them left. Caleb, Avery, Briggs, Harker, and Tyler. They found the evacuation trail marked with green flares, which meant they were being directed back. A helicopter was waiting for them, as if everything was normal. Men in black, without insignia, searched them in silence. They took their weapons, notebooks, any electronic device. Caleb tried to argue, but only received a blank stare. At the military hospital, 2 of the soldiers, Tyler and Briggs, were admitted immediately. Official diagnosis: collapse from extreme exhaustion. But Caleb learned, when he tried to visit them, that there was no record of their hospitalization. No number, no room. A nurse, in a low voice, simply said, "They're not here." A few days later, Caleb managed to find one of the doctors involved in the exercise. He too was silent, until he looked the sergeant in the eye and said, "Don't ever talk to me about that again, for your own safety." Tyler disappeared from the radar. And Briggs. Caleb heard from third parties that he had been transferred to a medical base in Alaska, but no one would confirm it. The other soldiers were dismissed with generic diagnoses. Caleb, now alone, began to put the pieces together. But what worried him most was Avery's behavior. The lieutenant was silent. He never spoke of what they had seen, until he disappeared, weeks later, on a North Carolina highway. It was an anonymous email that reignited Caleb's search. A single sentence: "I was there. I saw what they put in you." Attached to the email was an incomplete medical report with erased words and the code RZ9 combat variant. The sender was a military doctor by the name of Peter Langford. Caleb traced the name and discovered that Langford had requested leave weeks after the exercise. He was out of the country. After insisting, Langford agreed to talk. The meeting took place over an encrypted call. The doctor was visibly tense, afraid. "They tested something on you that we didn't even know about." The substance was a variant of a neural stimulant designed to eliminate emotional barriers, but it goes further. It activates areas of the brain that shouldn't even work under stress. Caleb asked why the records had disappeared. The answer came with tears. Because it worked, and they want to test it again. Langford said that 2 of the soldiers tested had died days later from internal bleeding and neurological failure. He also said that there were documents, samples, videos, but that everything had been confiscated by a special division. They let me leave the country as a warning, but if I talk too much, I won't get out alive. Before closing, Langford left one last clue. Look up Razor 9. That was the final name of the compound. But be careful, the name alone attracts attention. 2 months after the end of the exercise, Caleb crossed the border into Canada with false documents and a plan that he considered suicidal. He no longer trusted any official network. He knew that his movements were being monitored, but he needed to find Langford personally. The doctor had sent him a coordinate, a remote cabin in the forests of British Columbia. It was there that he hid what was left of the evidence. The journey was silent and lonely. Caleb slept in cheap motels, changed cars in every town and used only cash. His paranoia grew at every turn. He had the feeling of being followed, and on more than one occasion he swore he saw the same black sedan parked in different spots. But he kept going, driven by something that wasn't anger, it was duty. When he found Langford, the doctor was weak, pale, as if he had aged by months. He was shaking and coughing constantly. He said that he had accidentally been exposed to a test version of the same compound in the laboratory. He showed Caleb a physical file, medical reports, MRI images of soldiers with abnormal activity in the prefrontal cortex, and transcripts of high command meetings. There was even a video, fragmented in black and white, of Perkins, days before he died, saying, "I can see through time." With the evidence in hand, Caleb devised a plan to leak the material to the press. He chose an investigative journalist, Eric Madsen, known for exposing clandestine operations in the Middle East. Madsen was skeptical at first, but it only took the first documents, especially the transcripts of the commandos' conversations, for his tone to change. "If this is real, it's the biggest illegal experiment on soldiers since MK Ultra," he said, but there was no time for publication. 3 days later, Madsen's apartment was raided. Nothing was taken except the devices containing the files. The journalist called Caleb, terrified. "They know. They're monitoring everything. Listen to me. You need to disappear for a while." Caleb hung up, but it was too late. He knew that his window of action had closed. He returned to Langford's cabin only to find it empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of escape, just one detail that sent a chill down his spine. The briefcase with the documents had been carefully put back, but it was empty, as if someone wanted him to know that none of it belonged to him anymore. A few days later, Caleb received a box in the mail, with no sender. Inside was Langford's original briefcase, but with only one item, a medical record with Caleb's own name on it. There was a record of the application of the compound, with the acronym RZ9 marked in red, and more, graphs showing changes in his brain pattern during exercise. He had been monitored more than the others. On the back of the document, a handwritten note, "Above average reactivity, potential candidate for Phase 2. Caleb felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He wasn't just a guinea pig. He was an important variable in the experiment. He began to rethink everything. The soldiers' words, their looks, their lapses. Could it be that, without realizing it, he too had succumbed? Was his apparent lucidity just part of the new normal? The thought ate away at him. He spent days in silence, looking at his reflection, trying to remember moments when his mind had failed him. But there was nothing obvious, or maybe everything was evidence. Was he really lucid, or was it just an advanced program reacting to its own illusion of autonomy? He began to film himself sleeping, to record conversations with himself. He looked for flaws, but it all seemed too normal. Razor 9. The name echoed like a blade in his head. Caleb discovered that the compound had been born within a subdivision of DARPA in 2017. Initially proposed as an extreme vigilance stimulant, RZ9 had evolved too quickly. It had been banned in 2020 after causing outbreaks in primates, but a high-ranking general had reportedly authorized secret human tests. That's what the exercise had been, an unofficial field phase. The name Razor 9 was not on any public list of military substances, not even among the experimental ones. It was as if it had never existed. But what Caleb discovered in a clandestine copy of an internal database shocked him. Other similar exercises had taken place in the deserts of Nevada, in the jungles of Guatemala, on isolated naval bases, all with similar results, and all with the same consequences: soldiers missing or interned. There was a line, written in code in the final report of the experiment in which I had taken part. Of the 12 exposed, 6 showed partial integration, 4 rejected, 2 were discarded. The terms were cold, almost clinical, but Caleb knew what they meant. What's more, he knew that integration meant something he didn't yet understand, but which was perhaps happening to him at that very moment. Caleb still had a backup hidden away on an encrypted USB stick. It contained audio recordings made with a micro device during training. Almost all of them were corrupted, but one in particular remained intact. It was a conversation between 2 officers at the start of the exercise, apparently unaware that they were being recorded. The voice of one of them said, "Let's see how far they can go without losing functionality. The emotional loss is already underway." The second replied, "What worries me is when they start to remember all this. Post-state consciousness can interfere with the parameters. If Caleb Morgan endures the full cycle, he'll be the proof." That was a punch in the gut. He was part of a hypothesis, and they expected him to remember, to have clarity. That's what they were testing in him. He tried making copies, sending them to trusted contacts, but all uploads failed. The files simply erased themselves the moment they were connected to the internet, as if there was a layer of control beyond his comprehension. He turned everything off. He was silent. He started writing by hand, just like in the old days, so that at least part of the truth wouldn't be lost if something happened to him. The news came from an independent Alaskan journalist in a short report that was barely circulated. An ex-military man had been found dead in a private medical facility. The name was omitted, but the physical description matched Briggs. The article said only that the patient presented with a severe convulsive condition before suffering multiple arrests. The hospital denied its existence in the official records. Caleb knew it was him, and he knew what it meant. They were wrapping up loose ends. Briggs had survived too long, perhaps manifested too many dangerous symptoms. This wasn't just containment, it was cleansing. Briggs' death hit him like a thunderclap. Not just for him, but for the feeling that the next person could be Tyler, or Avery, or himself. So he decided to act urgently. He made one last physical copy of all the documents he still had and mailed them in sealed envelopes to 4 people he trusted from his military past. None of them replied. And over the next few days, Caleb noticed figures in his street, the same black car parked at different times. They were close, but what they wanted from him was still unclear. He was no longer just a witness, he was the result. In a desperate attempt, Caleb sought out an old colonel from his battalion, someone who owed him his life. He hoped that at least he would still have access to the high command behind the scenes. They arranged to meet at a decommissioned base on the outskirts of Oklahoma. When he arrived, Caleb found the old colonel looking grim and tired. "You shouldn't have dug that up, Caleb," was the first thing he heard. For 20 minutes, the colonel confirmed with careful words that unofficial exercises had been conducted, but there was nothing more. Razor 9 had been officially ruled out. Those involved were dead, expatriated, or missing. The army denied everything. No documents, no signatures, just shadows. "You're the only one who knows too much and is still alive," said the colonel before leaving. Caleb left the base knowing that he would have no more institutional help, but deep down, he felt that he no longer needed it. What was inside him, the memory, the change, the trauma, was already the real record, and maybe that's why they hadn't eliminated it yet. They were waiting, watching, calculating his mind's next move. Shortly before he disappeared completely, Caleb recorded one last video interview. He didn't trust platforms, so he did as the information guerrillas did. He used an analog camera, magnetic tape, and a neutral background. In 30 minutes, he told everything, with pauses. His voice sometimes trembled, not like a whistleblower, but as a man who had seen too much and survived. On the tape, he described what he felt, the lapses, the voices, the fear of no longer knowing what was real. He spoke of each soldier, one by one, with watery eyes. He described the transformations, the empty smiles, the incomprehensible words. He ended with a phrase that would later become almost a cult whisper among theorists and conspiracists. "If the mind can be bent until it breaks, and still work. What's left of us? The tape was sent to a secret address. Some say it still exists, guarded by journalists who are afraid to divulge it. Others say it was intercepted. But one thing is certain. After that video, Caleb disappeared. Not a sign, not a fingerprint, as if he had evaporated, or, as some suggest, as if he had finally been integrated. Months after Caleb's disappearance, rumors began to circulate in restricted military intelligence forums. There was a new acronym emerging behind the scenes: Project Vigilant. No official document, just scattered mentions in footnotes and contracts with biotech companies. Apparently, it would be a continuation of Razor 9, more sophisticated, more subtle, and now, with neurological implants instead of injectable compounds. Former soldiers reported unexpected summonses for medical updates. One of them, on condition of anonymity, said he had dreamt for weeks about the same symbol drawn by Harker on the trees in the forest. Another claimed to hear radio sounds inside his head, even with clean scans, but none of them could prove it. The tests always came back normal, as if everything was exactly as it should be. The idea that Razor 9 had evolved into something even more invisible, a mind control tool in the guise of operational enhancement, began to spread. But the truth, as always, was denied. Officially, none of this ever existed. Neither did Caleb, nor the exercises, nor the voices, just noise. Caleb Morgan's name never appeared on any official list of operations, neither as a dead man, nor as a deserter. His past was wiped clean, his story buried. But those who knew him, the few who remain, still tell, in whispers, what they saw in his eyes in his final days. Something between despair and understanding, like someone who saw the other side of the veil and came back with their mind in pieces. In the dark archives of the internet, someone recently posted a photo, a blurry image of a man standing on the side of a snowy road in Canada, wearing an old military jacket and staring into the forest. The caption was short: "The mind doesn't forget, it just adapts." Many say it's a fake, others believe it, but what no one can deny is the silence that remained afterwards. Because when reality is broken so profoundly, what remains is not revolt, nor justice, nor redemption. What remains is silence, an absolute silence where not even the truth can breathe. And that's where the ghosts of Razor 9 live.